While capturing a moment with a camera feels effortless today, it's a stark contrast to the limitations of the past. For most of human history, words and illustrations were our primary tools for preserving what we saw. The early 1800s, however, witnessed a remarkable shift as brilliant minds paved the way for a new method of capturing our world. In 1826, the earliest surviving photograph emerged in France, and more than a decade later, Louis Daguerre revolutionized the field with the daguerreotype, making photography more accessible and laying the foundation for its global impact. But while photography flourished in many parts of the world during its early years, Japan had a unique historical context. The country maintained a policy of seclusion, limiting foreign influences and hindering the initial adoption of photography. However, despite these initial barriers, photography eventually managed to sneak its way past isolation policies and fears of foreign influences, quickly captivating the whole nation and forever altering how the Japanese documented their history. Today, let's embark on a journey into the fascinating history of Japanese photography. We'll explore how this European technology made its way to Japan, uncovering its evolution as an art form, a thriving business, and a constantly developing technology from its very beginnings to the present day. If you end up enjoying this video, make sure to tell the algorithm how you feel and leave a like. And make sure to subscribe to the channel for more Japanese history and crime content. Oh, and that Patreon page is also still there, in case you want to support me for as little as $1 per month. Now, back to the video. This is the history of photography in Japan. So, photography in Japan. Where do we even get started? That's a bit of a difficult question to answer, because research for this video led me to more than just one story about how the Japanese first encountered the wonders of photography. One of these stories takes us on a quest to find the first photograph ever taken of a Japanese person. Now, while that may sound like it checks all the boxes of what we are looking for, it's a bit more complicated than that, because you see, the first photo of a Japanese person was neither taken in Japan, nor was it taken by a Japanese person. Instead, it was taken far, far away from Japan, in the US. I know that sounds kinda weird, but let me explain. In February of 1851, a Japanese ship by the name of Erikimaru got caught in a severe storm in the Pacific Ocean and was consequently blown completely off its intended course. The ship's mast broke off, leaving the crew of 18 men shipwrecked in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That was until an American freighter, the Auckland, spotted the Erikimaru, rescuing its 17 surviving crew members and bringing them along to San Francisco. Returning to Japan wasn't exactly an option for the crew of the Erikimaru, because remember, this was in 1851, a couple of years before Japan's more than 250 years long isolation policy was finally lifted. Leaving Japan was strictly forbidden, and returning home might have gotten the whole crew executed. And so, the crew of the Erikimaru ended up staying in San Francisco for a full year, also making them some of the first Japanese ever to visit the US. Of course, that was kind of a big deal, big enough for someone to decide that this special occasion needed to be captured for future generations. That someone was Harvey R. Marks, a photographer from Baltimore who took several daguerreotype portraits of the crew. The ship's cook, Sentaro, was the first crew member to be photographed, also making him the very first Japanese person in history to be photographed. When you really think about it, that's pretty cool. The first Japanese to have his photo taken wasn't an emperor, a shogun, or a high-ranking samurai leader, but a regular old cook who somehow ended up in a faraway foreign country that almost none of his fellow countrymen had ever seen. After a year, the majority of the crew was sent to Macau, but one member, a 14-year-old boy named Hamada Hikozo, decided to stay in the US. Not only that, but he would later become the first Japanese person ever to receive US citizenship, changing his name to Joseph Heiko. Oh, and apparently there's an asteroid named after him. Pretty cool. So now that we've established who the first Japanese person ever to be photographed was, what about the first photo actually taken in Japan? Fast forward 3 years to 1854, when American naval officer Matthew C. Perry was leading an expedition that would eventually end up putting an end to the aforementioned Japanese isolation policy. Following him on this historically significant expedition was a man named Eliphalet Brown Jr., a photographer and lithographer. On their 2-year journey, Brown was able to take an estimated 400 different daguerreotype photographs, which captured the Americans' first significant contacts with the Japanese. Some of these photos were later destroyed in a fire. Some of them received lithograph copies that give us a good idea of what Eliphalet Brown Jr. captured with his camera in the 1850s. The whereabouts of most of the original photos are unfortunately a bit of a mystery, but a handful of them have actually been located, giving us a glimpse at the first photos ever taken in Japan. But as historically significant as these stories are, do they truly mark the beginning of Japanese photography? No, not really. What we really need to do is find out when the Japanese started taking photos by themselves. And in order to do that, we actually go back a few years, from where we just left off, to 1848. On Dejima, an artificial island which served as a trading post for foreign merchants who wanted to do business with the Japanese despite the isolation policy, Dutch merchants brought in a peculiar item that the Japanese had never seen before: a daguerreotype camera. A Japanese merchant by the name of Ueno Shunocho acquired the camera and handed it to one of the local clans. But obviously, no one really understood how to use the damn thing. After all, taking photos back then was a bit more complicated than just pressing a button and applying a dog filter. And so, the clan soon returned the camera to the Dutch merchants, which could have been the end of this story, if it wasn't for a few very curious locals who made it their mission to find out how to replicate the photography process by themselves. 2 clans in particular, including the Shimazu clan, were at the forefront of this research, which was done only with the help of a few textbooks and manuals left by the Dutch merchants. After close to 10 years of partially successful attempts, the Shimazu clan managed to produce Japan's first photographic image in 1857. Fittingly, it was a photo of the clan's leader, Shimazu Nariakira, a man known for having been curious about everything that came from foreign lands since he was a child. But unfortunately, Shimazu Nariakira passed away the following year and never got the chance to see just how far photography in Japan would soon come. The end of Japan's isolation policy was fast approaching, and the subsequent opening of its borders allowed foreigners, and with them new camera equipment, to come in. The daguerreotype cameras were soon replaced by cameras that utilized the so-called wet collodion method, which could be developed in a matter of only a few minutes and allowed for multiple prints of the same photo. Not only was that convenient, but it also inspired photo enthusiasts to turn their hobby into a business for the first time. Japan's first commercial photo studio was opened in 1860 by American photographer Orrin Freeman, who is also said to have been the first foreign photographer to make a living and permanently reside in Japan. But he was actually responsible for more than just one first in Japan's photographic history. That same year, Freeman sold his camera equipment to a samurai, Ukai Gyokuzen, who then opened a photo studio of his own, becoming Japan's first professional photographer. But while Ukai Gyokuzen might have been the first, much more talented Japanese photographers were soon walking the same path. In 1862, Shimooka Rensho opened his first photo studio in Yokohama, a port city that would later become a hotspot for both tourism and photography. Shimooka became fascinated with photography after seeing a daguerreotype during a visit to the house of a Tokugawa clan member, and from that moment on made it his mission to learn photography himself. He learned the basics from a Dutch translator, and in the early 1860s, after moving to Yokohama, successfully obtained his own camera equipment and soon took lessons from American photographer Julia Brown, beginning his journey towards becoming a true professional. Over the following 15 years, Shimooka was able to establish himself as a leading figure in the field. He not only honed his photographic skills to a masterful level, but also built a thriving business with multiple studios in Yokohama, while generously sharing his knowledge by instructing numerous aspiring Japanese photographers. Today, Shimooka Rensho is often referred to as the father of Japanese photography for his pivotal role in fostering the art form within the country. Then there was Ueno Hikoma, whose path towards learning photography was a lot more straightforward than that of Shimooka. In fact, it almost seemed as if he was destined to be a photographer. After all, he was the son of the aforementioned merchant who imported Japan's very first camera. Ueno became known as a master of both portrait and landscape photography, who also didn't shy away from charging a pretty penny for his high-quality work. At the same time, Japan was just about to begin their efforts towards becoming an industrialized nation, which turned out to be an absolute blessing for the country's photography scene. Visitors from all over the world still saw Japan as an escape from the loud and busy industrial lifestyle that had taken over the West. And with foreigners coming to Japan in droves, an exchange between experienced Western photographers and the Japanese took place, which made sure that Japanese photography matured at a rapid pace. One of these Western photographers arrived in Yokohama in 1863, an Italian-British man by the name of Felice Beato. By then, Felice Beato had already established himself as an incredibly gifted and experienced cameraman, a pioneer in his field who, after documenting the Second Opium War in China in a series of images, was credited as being one of the very first war photographers. Beato would settle down in Japan for quite a while, partaking in numerous business ventures and becoming the most respected photographer in Japan throughout the 1860s and 70s. Many of the images that he captured became iconic. I've personally been very familiar with much of his work before even doing any research for this video, and never realized that one man took all of these incredible pictures. Take for example this amazing photo of a group of Satsuma clan samurai captured during the decisive Boshin War, which would later spell the end of the shogunate's rule over Japan. What makes these images so fascinating to me is the fact that they were taken just before Japan became westernized in so many ways. They offer us a glimpse into a country and culture that, even back then, was so incredibly different from what the rest of the world had to offer. Also, the samurai that we usually get to see are either illustrations or people in costumes. But this is real. We are looking at a photograph of an actual samurai soldier in armor here. That's incredible. As you can see, I am pretty fascinated with Beato's images, and I'm certainly not the only one. During his 14-year stay, both the Japanese as well as the Westerners became obsessed with his work, which was not only visually appealing, but also innovative. Keep in mind that all of these photos were originally black and white, with color photography still far away from becoming truly mainstream. In order to solve this problem, black and white photographs were colored by hand in what was a long, arduous process. It is said that a hand-coloring expert could only complete around 3 photos during a 12-hour shift. Coloring photographs was an art in its own right, one that required talented and experienced artists, and thankfully, Japan had more than enough of those. Actually, a lot of Japanese photo coloring artists at the time came from the ukiyo-e woodblock print business, the biggest competitor of Japan's early photography studios. But as woodblock printing started to become less and less popular compared to photography, many woodblock coloring artists lost their jobs. Thankfully though, their skills transitioned into the coloring of photographs almost seamlessly, providing them with a new way of using their talents to bring food to the table. Due to the location of Beato's and many other photo studios in Yokohama, this style of hand-colored photographs became known across Japan as Yokohama Shashin, or Yokohama-style photographs. Beato was at the forefront of the Yokohama Shashin style, and while he certainly wasn't the first to color his photographs, his numerous studios were responsible for many innovations in the field and pretty much set the standard for what hand-colored photographs from Japan should look like. Yokohama Shashin found an audience especially with tourists, and Beato was a genius in marketing his product to this exact audience. His studios were some of the first in Japan to sell photo albums, which usually contained anywhere from 25 up to 100 different prints. He also offered custom-made albums for tourists, which were filled with prints that matched the customer's trip across Japan and the landmarks that they had visited along the way. Many of these images were staged in order to look as Japanese as possible. Photos of geisha, for example, were obviously super popular, along with certain landscapes and sceneries like Mount Fuji, cherry blossoms, and all that good stuff. While offering a picture-perfect glimpse of Japan, these photo albums often presented a more idealized and everyday perspective, but that's exactly what the tourists wanted. These photo albums were then taken to countries all over the world, meaning that in many cases, this was the first time that an international audience was exposed to Japan's culture and traditions, making photo albums an influential part of history that seems to be quite often overlooked. Felice Beato left Japan in 1877, selling his Yokohama studio to yet another foreign photographer and a fellow countryman of mine, the Austrian photographer Baron Raimund von Stillfried. Von Stillfried became an important photographer in his own right, and much like Felice Beato before him, he targeted Yokohama's many tourists as his main customer base. Actually, there were quite a few foreign photographers in Japan who did exactly the same thing, like the Italian Adolfo Farsari or the French Daguerre brothers, who set up shop in Nagasaki, yet another tourist and photography hotspot of late 19th century Japan. Photography was now clearly a viable business that only became more and more profitable and competitive as time went on, especially with Japan's industrialization going full steam ahead under the leadership of Emperor Meiji. Speaking of which, Emperor Meiji was the first emperor of Japan to be photographed. These two famous shots, taken in 1872 and 1873 respectively, are the earliest official photographs of Emperor Meiji, taken by the renowned Japanese photographer Uchida Suichi, who received exclusive permission to photograph the divine emperor. But there's another photo of the emperor that was captured a few months earlier than that, a photo that was taken illegally, without permission. On January 1st, 1872, Emperor Meiji attended the inauguration of the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. Unbeknownst to him and his guards, sneaky old Raimund von Stilfried was hiding in a ship that was docked nearby and managed to take this photo, the first photo of a Japanese emperor ever taken. The photographic ninja called Raimund von Stilfried was never punished for taking this photo, but the government did find out about it and quickly prohibited its sale. Understanding the potential risks, including confiscation or even destruction, the photograph was carefully moved overseas where it thankfully survived, becoming a significant piece of history with a cool little backstory. Foreign photographers like Felice Beato or Raimund von Stilfried certainly had somewhat of a head start in terms of turning photography into a business. But the Japanese soon caught up with their European competitors, and by the 1880s, they were able to produce work of the same or even higher quality for a much lower price than foreign competitors. One of the most successful photographers/businessmen of the 1880s was Tamamura Kozaburo, a man who enjoyed making some pretty confident claims about his products, as shown by this advertisement from the 1891 edition of the Japan Directory. Quote, "The largest and the best stock of the finest views of celebrated places in Japan. My coloring has been pronounced by competent judges to be unsurpassed by any in this country, although my charges are much lower than those made by other photographers. Attention is also called to the fact that as I use only the best chemicals, my photographs are durable and do not fade." Tamamura, however, seems to have delivered on his promises. His hand-colored photos from that time period are said to have aged pretty well, compared to some of his competitors' products. Also, his customers were seemingly happy with what they received. His albums sold like hotcakes, and his studios would stay in business for over 30 years. Now, there's way too many amazing Japanese photographers from this time period to even attempt to name them all, and I could probably spend hours talking about the careers and achievements of guys like the legendary Kusakabe Kinbei. But in terms of sheer influence, few Japanese photographers were able to match Ogawa Kazumasa, maybe the greatest photographer of the Meiji era. Ogawa was born as the son of a samurai and retainer to the Matsudaira clan. He studied both photography and printing in the US, and as soon as he returned to Japan, set up his business, celebrating one huge success after another right off the bat, quickly becoming one of the most beloved photographers in the country and even receiving several jobs from the Japanese government. In 1889, he became one of the founding members of the Photographic Society of Japan, and that very same year, launched a magazine called Koka, Japan's first ever art magazine, which is still being published today, more than 130 years later. In the meantime, photo studios were pretty much forced to diversify their business in order to stay afloat. As technology advanced, photography became more and more accessible to the general public, and many tourists started bringing their own handheld cameras with them. Postcards, for example, proved to be a very reliable source of income for photo studios, as was camera equipment and other photography-related items like picture frames. The technological advancements of the early 20th century didn't avoid the Japanese islands, of course. It was around this time that Japan, now an industrialized nation, started dabbling in the production of cameras itself, which early on were often mere clones of German products. But Japan put its newly found industrial power to good use, establishing multiple companies that would go on to dominate the camera space decades later. In 1917, for example, 3 different companies merged into Nippon Kogaku Kogyo Kabushiki Kaisha, or Japanese Optical Technology Company, which later became known under the name Nikon. Then, in 1919, the company that would later become Olympus was founded, and in 1933 and 1934 respectively, Canon and Fujifilm were born. Many of these companies were obviously deeply involved in aiding future war efforts. Fujifilm, for example, built cameras used by Japan for aerial photography during World War II. Among some of the Japanese photographers that managed to establish themselves during the war were Domon Ken, Kimura Ihe, and Natori Yonosuke. all three of which excelled in photojournalism, a form of photography that really took off between the 1930s and the 1950s, when it was more important than ever to not only keep the whole world informed about the victories, the losses, the horrors, and the tragedies of the Second World War, but also about its aftermath and, especially in Japan's case, its miraculous rebuild. Japan's post-war period was captured by game-changing photographers like Shomei Tomatsu, while guys like Hosoe Eiko brought something a bit more experimental to the table. The future of Japanese photography was looking bright, and not only in a creative sense, but also in terms of technology. Some of the world's biggest camera manufacturers, those from Germany to be exact, found themselves in a difficult spot following the Second World War. The Japanese, who had been quietly improving their camera technology for many years at that point, were now ready to enter and soon even dominate the ever-growing camera market. And interestingly, a chain of events related to the Korean War of the 1950s ended up kickstarting the hype around cameras made in the land of the rising sun. It all began when Japanese photographer Miki Jun, who also worked for Life magazine at the time, spoke to one of his colleagues, the American David Douglas Duncan. At some point, Duncan started asking Miki about his camera equipment, which was produced by Nikon, and after a visit to the company's headquarters, the American was convinced that he had to at least give the Japanese lenses a shot. And so, he did. He replaced all his lenses with those made by Nikon, and soon made his way to the Korean peninsula where he was supposed to document the ongoing war. Duncan was blown away by his new lenses. For a fraction of the price of Western-made products, the Nikon lenses delivered incredibly high-quality images that were comparable to the best on the market. This video, by the way, is not sponsored by Nikon, I promise. But Duncan wasn't the only one who was impressed. Life magazine photo editor Frank Churchill, who printed Duncan's photos, called the Nikon camera's negatives the sharpest that he had ever developed. Subsequently, Duncan's article on the war, which was published in the New York Times, was accompanied by a direct comparison between a German-made Zeiss camera and the equipment used by Duncan to cover the Korean War. Comparisons showed that the Nikon product delivered equal, if not even better results than its Zeiss competitor, all at a much lower price. This comparison allegedly enraged Dr. Karl Bauer, then president of Carl Zeiss USA, who claimed that the test was not done properly, calling the results a complete lie. Now, I am by no means a camera expert. Maybe Dr. Bauer was right, but the damage had been done, and word about the affordable product from Japan spread like wildfire. Soon, Japanese camera manufacturers had conquered the US market, then Germany, and at some point the whole world. The camera market, along with other consumer electronics, cars, etc., played a big role in Japan's post-war economic miracle, which at one point had Japan placed as the second highest economy in the world, behind only the US. Even now, with the Japanese economy struggling hard, the country's camera business shows no signs of slowing down. As of 2019, Japanese companies commanded a whopping 89% of the world's digital camera market. Not bad, considering that until the 1950s, no one would have even considered buying a Japanese camera. It's fascinating to see how far Japanese photography has come over the past 1.5 centuries, both as a business and as an art form. Along the way, cameras have managed to capture the very essence of Japan in multiple ways. From ordinary people to soldiers and divine emperors, from beautiful sceneries to ugly wars, from a country's crushing defeat to its eventual rise from the ashes. From early struggles capturing even a single image to crafting some of the world's most coveted cameras, I think it's safe to say that photography has become deeply woven into the very fabric of Japan. Who is your favorite Japanese photographer? I'm sure I missed out on mentioning at least one of them, so let us know in the comments down below. Again, a big thank you goes out to all my Patreon supporters listed here, including Busner, Javier Soravia, Capybara Chuck, White Gilden, Justin Down, and Yoko the Space Whale. And to every single one of you who made it all the way to the end, as always, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.